My name is Don Weiss. It's the 22nd of January in the year 2024, and I've been working on some things, and I want people to join in. I'm a retired philosophy professor, and just now I find myself in the midst of some of the most interesting work that I've ever done. I have been spending many, many years working at the foundations of Judaism and Christianity, um, trying to understand what is at the root of the Bible from the Jewish point of view. I am a Jew myself, and that of course, is of overwhelming importance to me, but also the Christian Bible, so-called New Testament, to which I have also given many, many years of study, and regard as just as important and just as much a key to what I want to talk about. But what I do want to talk about is also, in just plain non-religious terms, the peace movement. I believe in the peace movement, but more than that, I believe that it is the idea, the deep idea of the peace movement, which is the very idea underlying both Judaism and Christianity, that the roots of Judaism and hence of Christianity can be found in the prophet, for example, that both religions revere, the prophet Isaiah. It's very important to begin, it seems to me, with an understanding of what Isaiah is all about, which is not primarily about religion at all. Religion is a set of rituals or practices, some of them very nice, but not what interests Isaiah at all. In fact, he tells you quite explicitly in the very first chapter that he doesn't care much about rituals. He doesn't even care much about prayer. What he cares about, very simply, is transforming the world from the place it is now, which is a world of antipathy, of mutual antagonism, of hatred, of war, of violence, transforming that world into a world that it should be and can be. In fact, it's a puzzle why it's not that way, a world of peace, in which we would all be better off, in which we'd all be far, far happier, in which life would not be nasty, mean, brutish, and short, but rather the joy of our desiring. I try to make this point very often by taking up this important text to me of Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol. I use the Scrooge story as a way of breaking into the problem itself, of trying to illuminate the no-brainer that I think that a prophet like Isaiah is motivated by, incredulity in the face of the violent world. He cannot grasp why we live this way when we don't have to live this way. Surely we should understand that we must not live this way. Must not meaning that we should stop doing it. The must here also for him was futuristic. He thought it was so much of a no-brainer that the world of peace that we should be living in is something that everybody would realize upon thinking about it is something we should work for, but just because he thought it was that rational, that incumbent on our spirit, our mind, to realize that such a world is a better place than the world order that we're living in now. Just for that reason, he also viewed it as inevitable. This is the predictive mode. I actually think it makes a lot of sense. If you believe something would be rational for people, then you're going to commit yourself somehow to the idea that sooner or later we're going to get around to seeing that and doing it. if it is indeed more rational, more reasonable, this idea that animates Isaiah, I want to revive. Of course, in our time, this is not Isaiah's time. He was living in the 700s BCE. And today we live under different circumstances with different resources, different problems too. But I want to take the spirit that's alive there, and as a member of the peace movement, I always have been, consider myself a member of the peace movement, revive these Isaiah ideas, which again, as I said, I also see in Dickens. I see many places. And in the modern context, revive it with all the resources of modern times, with all the scientific understanding that we have now, even mathematical. I think that game theory in mathematics, for example, is relevant to showing the no-brainerhood of peace solutions. So that there's one branch. I think that sociology, psychology, various modern fields can make great contributions toward understanding what it is about the human mind that makes this idea compelling. The peace idea, the real peace idea, the idea that we could stop doing things this way, solving our problems, that is, in this counterproductive way that we call war, for example, and realizing that if just for a moment we began doing things differently, if we were, so to speak, under some kind of, taboo for a moment. Imagine a genie cast a spell, and for a moment we just are under a taboo that we just couldn't solve our problems through war, that we'd actually have to do it a different way, that very soon, if we were to live under such a taboo, that very soon we would see that we were far, far better off this way than we had been, that we were alive and our children were alive, and moreover, that forced to talk with one another, forced to deal with one another in nonviolent ways, we discover, this is the hypothesis that the peace advocate like me has and wants to develop, would discover that the solution to these problems, the non-destructive, imagine the destruction of war that's going on these days, the destruction is terrible, and this real destruction of people, of valuable resources, buildings leveled, whatnot. It's a horror story what's going on. These resources, to keep them rather than to lose them, to keep our children rather than to lose them, and to solve our problems in a way that actually would be mutually amicable. Of course, it sounds like a pipe dream. I understand that. It always does. That's why it seems to me very important to show that it can be sustained on what I call even a mathematical or socio-political level, and I think it can be. And I want to get aggressive about that. I'm looking to form alliances with other people who want to get aggressive about that point. No, I'm not a flake or a snowflake, as they say these days. I want to be hard-nosed about this. Today, I want to take up one aspect of this just in broad outline to show you what I'm talking about. In a previous recording that I did back in December, I spent a session actually on one of the things that I would like to develop. That was a single session that I did on Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol, the whole Scrooge thing. I'd actually love to have something going that might be called the Scrooge Seminar, say. Call it the Scrooge Seminar, in which we would take up all the issues having to do with what I call the the peace no-brainer and why it is a no-brainer and what we can do in response to its no-brainerhood to bring it to the world. And here I would appeal to some of my friends. I'm an old guy, but to some of my friends who know a lot about the internet and so forth. Look, the old prophets, Jesus too, following in the prophets' footsteps, actually believed that they had their hands on something here that ought to go viral. They actually thought of it in those terms. Going viral, they thought, was assured. In other words, that it would catch on, that there would be a takeoff, a dramatic takeoff, a quantum jump. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks frequently in terms of the metaphor of the seed, which suddenly, that little tiny mustard seed, that's one of his, that suddenly becomes a big bush. It's just a dramatic metaphor for how little things can quickly burgeon into something great. The idea of going viral is involved in that it would catch on, that there was a contagion, an infectiousness that would spread out, but at each branch there are 2, 3 nodes coming out, and each further branch there are 2, just like contacting people on the net. You contact 2 people who contact 2 people who contact 2 people in whatever way you want to spread the news of some concert or whatever you want to do. You could do it that. But what I'm saying is the inherent possibility of virality, of infectiousness of good ideas is something that seems to me that would be more possible than ever now that we have these technologies. If Jesus back in his time could talk about going viral, as he does with the seed metaphor, this burgeoning metaphor, how much more could we in our time? So I would want to get into all that in this Scrooge seminar. The other line, besides that wonderful whole, that's modernistic, it's not historical, it's a discussion of the possibilities of the current age. That's the one I would call the Scrooge seminar. There's another one, though, that I've been working on lately, working on an outline of lately. I've forced myself to try to come up with a kind of outline that summarizes the work that I've been doing at the foundations of biblical studies for the last few decades. 30 years or so I've been devoting to this, both, again, as I said, to Judaism and Christianity. And in talking with my partner, Jeff, about where it might be useful to start in this aspect, getting, which I have to, this is a second seminar, so to speak. It's the idea of getting to the roots of the what we call the Judeo-Christian idea. It's to state it in somewhat fancy terms, but something like that. I want to show that what I have been talking about, this deep peace idea, is at the very core and essence of both Judaism and Christianity. And I want to show that by taking an actual look at what these texts are all about and what happens in these texts. I want to consider, for example, by studying them, stages in the development of Judaism, which includes a consideration of Christianity as well as a development out of Judaism. And in preparing for today, I came up with a sequence of 6 steps. It's an outline in 6 steps. Don't misunderstand me as saying history has 6 stages. I'm just saying here's a way that I found useful to set up a staging of some important stages of the development of Judaism-Christianity, And I came up with a 6-part outline. I can imagine doing it in many different ways. This is just the way I figured out would be good for today. The first one would be to show stage one. Let me see how quickly I might just go through this to give you an idea of the sweep of what I'm talking about. The first stage is actually a consideration of what I think is the deepest strand of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is to be found in the great prophets, the great pre-exilic prophets. They can be named. Isaiah, to me, is the most important. I include Jeremiah. But going back to around Isaiah's time, Isaiah's much earlier than Jeremiah. We could say Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, and then Jeremiah. I'm trying to look at the essence of what their prophecy is all about. Part one of what I would do is try to show, and of course I would want to talk about with whoever will engage in this study with me, why it is that we can say truthfully that the core of the message of Isaiah is that of the necessity of a world of peace, that this is what is mandated, and this is what is inevitable. If it is absolutely mandated and absolutely inevitable, then in the language of theology, it's something that God requires of us. That's the way he thought of it. That's the way he thought of the voice of reason that he heard as being at the foundations of the universe. It's no wonder that he called it God. We can call it anything we want. I'm not trying to turn off people who don't like religious terminology. I'll speak in philosophical terms, and we can avoid the theological terminology. But Isaiah did use God as his point of reference in talking that way. And he sets the stage for a great, what we call religion. He gives birth, I think, in this idea of the necessity and inevitability of the spreading of a world of peace, superseding the world of violence that we currently live in. But this is at the foundation of Judaism, because the Jews themselves take Isaiah to be, in that sense, a founder, the greatest of the literary prophets. I refer to Isaiah 1, by the way, the first 39 chapters. We can get into those technicalities later. I want to get back to my outline. If stage one is showing the prophetic idea of the no-brainerhood of the peace movement, of the success of the peace movement, stage two is seeing what happens next as the people who come up with this idea actually try to implement it. Stage two is what you might call the Deuteronomic state. It's the state of Judaism, a real political movement that seizes the imagination of the actual culture in this little country called Judah, an actually existing place where at a certain moment in history, actually right around the year 621 BCE, the Isaian platform actually becomes the constitution of a country. A country is born that seems to be dedicating itself to Isaian principles. And that country is Judah. The king is Josiah. A reform, we have the main constitution of that state, which are a lot of the core chapters of the current book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, as we have it, has additions to it that were added in later ages, and yet we can identify the core documents within Deuteronomy that give us a very, very clear idea of how these people tried very seriously to implement their ideas and to realize them in the context of an actual living culture. It's one thing to have the idea that Isaiah is proclaiming and to criticize the world on its basis. It's yet another thing to try to bring these ideas to bear, to embody them in actual social institutions, to build a state, an actual society, based on actual laws, actual ways of proceeding, ways of treating people, requiring, for example, very, very specifically, for example, requiring that everybody be maintained, that the widow, the orphan, the stranger in your midst, everybody is guaranteed a life. You got to feed them, got to give them medical care. Back then already, the prophets were saying any good society is based upon guaranteeing everybody there, including your guests, by the way. That means foreigners. You're foreign, very, very big for them. The rules had to include protection of travelers that you had already welcomed in. You must, if they're in your midst, you must protect them. Rules of court procedure, but above, these are very, very important, by the way, setting up a culture of justice where things are done correctly, where when you have a problem, you can settle the problem in court, where rules of honest testimony are rigorously enforced, where bribery is forbidden clearly, and penalties for judges who succumb to any form of that corruption. This is all very clearly spelled out, but perhaps most of all, as the foundation of this project that we can find still in this oldest of all the books of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, that's the fifth book, Deuteronomy. We don't think of it often as the oldest, but it is. In that book, the oldest document that we have, we find really the most important moment to be the Ten Commandments, which are clearly given, dramatically given. And these 10 founding ideas, of course, strike to the very core of what the society is supposed to be about. And they're very, very rich in their meaning. Honor your father and mother, for example, just taking one. Actually, that's a whole complex of ideas. They were talking, by the way, when they talked about honor thy father and thy mother, with the fact that it was incumbent upon the citizenry to make sure that the parental generation was always taken care of. This is concrete. This is economic. This is a requirement that certain people, categories of people, I already mentioned the widow, the orphan, the stranger in your midst, everybody. That means the person who's least on the totem pole. You must make sure that these people are taken care of. And when you turn to the Ten Commandments, which we tend to read very, very glibly, you see actually here, when you start to see it as the core of an actual constitution, of an actual historical state. Again, this is the state of Judah or Judea in approximately the year 621, a year that the historians have figured out because they figured out when this document, when the reform of Josiah actually seems to have been put into effect. It seems to be a datable year. That at the very heart of this document, we have the Ten Commandments, now understood to be, it's not a Bill of Rights exactly, but it's a Bill of Basic Principles, which stand, as I said before, for a lot. Thou shalt not commit adultery opens up a whole category of things having to do with the importance of marriage in the culture, and when spelled out would entail a whole lot of different specific laws and regulations, and it does right there in Deuteronomy. We have a whole chapter based upon the adultery thing, which is the total elaboration of a whole set of rules of divorce, for example. And there are other things going on here too, having to do with the importance of the institution of marriage to the Judaic culture, which are deeply important. All I'm trying to say here is that this text of a state of Judea, which attempts a great experiment at this particular time, this text of Deuteronomy should be studied, but the idea of it, that they actually tried to realize it, should be taken with great seriousness. And I think we have to revive our thinking, our own thinking in that respect. In many respects, the foundations of the United States mirror this kind of conception of the redesign of a well-ordered society. But now stage 3. Stage 1 was the original prophetic stage. Stage 2 is this stage that I want to locate in Judea in the 7th century, principally BCE, where an attempt is actually made to realize the ideas of the prophets in concrete institutions of an actual state, an actual society. But now stage 3, because now it gets very dramatic. Something quite tragic happens. I won't go into all the reasons, all the historical discussion that goes into why the Jews suffered utter destruction and exile. But soon after these Josiah reforms, only a couple of decades later, it was all over. Because of some, errors in judgment. Josiah himself made some errors in judgment. Mistakes were made. Perhaps they couldn't have avoided it anyway, but they got into trouble with the Babylonians, who were in charge, the empire in charge of things. Instead of playing their cards right, I'll give some blame to the Babylonians too, but on the Judean side, there was a certain degree of that. For various complex reasons, however, push came to shove with the Babylonian Empire, a lot bigger than the little kingdom of Judah was. And in 2 stages, Judah suffered defeat. First in 597, a first exile occurred, and then further events in 587 and 586 led to the final and utter catastrophe. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, just utterly lost patience with these Judeans with whom he had some problems, and he decided to level the place. He went into Jerusalem and he just leveled it to the ground. Read the book of Lamentations in the Bible, written apparently by Jeremiah, about what Jerusalem was like after the destruction of the first temple, which occurred in the year 587 or 6. It was a national catastrophe. And the cream of Judean society was forced into exile in the Babylonian Empire, most of them in the actual city of Babylon and in cities in that area of the lower Euphrates River where the empire was situated. The Jews were exported. They were forced to live there. It's a very smart move on the part of Babylonians. What they simply did was they carried off into exile we might say, cream of the society. I mean no disparagement to other people, but it was the entire intelligentsia of Jewish society was removed, crippling the country thereby. You steal their, and by the way, the Babylonians made very good use of these Jewish, of this Jewish intelligentsia. They used them for their own purposes in Babylon. It was a terrible period of time to be living in exile. Some did better than others. Many, of course, ached for what was happening to them. And you can read the 137th Psalm on that subject, by the way, if you want to get a clear sense of how bitter the experience of the exile was, then read the ever so disturbing, horrific, if you will, 137th Psalm. I'm not going to break the suspense right now by telling you what it's about. Maybe I'll provoke you to take a look at it. But Psalm 137, famous song comes out of it, by the way. The Melodians made a song, reggae song in the year 1970. They were Rastafarians, the Melodians. They made in Jamaica, made a song called By the Rivers of Babylon. That's how Psalm 137 begins. The Melodians took, it was a great song. By the way, it became one of the great cuts on the album, The Harder They Fall by, the great reggae album. Jimmy Cliff and all that. Read the psalm, however. They don't include the complete psalm. It has an ending which is horrifying. That gets left out of the Melodian song. But it's a song of exile and the horror of exile and the hatred that can lead to. This is my point now in stage 3. The Jews suffer bitterly, and it leads, this is what I call the essence of stage 3, to the formation of a narrower expression of the Judaic idea. If in Josiah's time there was this aspiration to create a society in which Israel would be the first of a great movement, and they actually do have in Deuteronomy this idea, and we will be an example to the nations thereby. I think the idea of infectiousness, of going viral, can be seen in that. If we have that in the earlier phase, now in stage 3, unfortunately, we have a reaction against that. Because of the treatment the Jews, some of them at least, feel they have been given at the hands of the nations, the Gentile world, they no longer feel as if this going out into the world and expanding their idea, starting with their own nation, but being a lamp unto the nations, as later people might put it. Second Isaiah does put it. Instead of this idea, you get the idea that the only way that Judaism can preserve itself and its essential ideas is by becoming its own very particular religion, with really very little outreach, spiritual outreach, to the world outside of itself. In particular, the second temple period is characterized, the chief text here to see, well, there are a couple. Two important texts would be the books of, very closely related books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are books about what happens after the return from exile, when finally the Jews are allowed to return to Judea. This is around 538. They go into exile 586 or 7, and they come out 539 or 8, depending on how they date things exactly. The texts in that subsequent period, the period after the end of the exile, two of the most important are Ezra and Nehemiah. Another, however, is the book of Leviticus, which quite clearly is drawn up at this time. I want to get back to this point just for a second. You may recall I said before that Deuteronomy comes first historically, and it does. It's the 5th book, but it comes first. Later on, books 1, 2, 3, and 4, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers come into play. They come into play at this point in history, in particular, during the period immediately after the exile, when Judaism is reestablished in Jerusalem, although Judea now is a province of the Persian Empire, quite happily so, but in the main, because they recognize the Persians as having given them their freedom, their ability to go back, and a good deal of local autonomy as a part of the empire. As long as they did the right thing and cooperated properly, they could have a large measure of Judaic independence, semi-independence, if you will. And they did so. And they drew up their own documents and had their own constitution. They invented, apparently, it's a monument to what they did, what we now call the Torah, taking that original document of Deuteronomy, placing it because they had to, because of the narrative and other reasons too. I'm not trying to put it down. There are reasons for all of this, but they arranged it in such a way now that we have the modern Pentateuchal 5-part Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We owe it to them. Now, if this is happening now in the 6th and 5th centuries, also into the 4th century BCE. And so now these very important, the Torah itself, the modern Torah itself now emerges as one of the most important documents. And alongside that, we have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are actually records of these foundational events that have to do with leaving Babylon and setting up the new temple. And they record the events of the new temple. In Leviticus, we have the rules, which now very clearly stipulate what Jews must follow and make it clear, on the other hand, and this is just as important, that Judaism is to achieve a certain kind of purity and distance from other people, separate itself spiritually from other people. Ethnic interaction was severely curtailed. One of the most prominent things about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is the prohibition on intermarriage. From this date, we can see very clearly that intermarriage with a Gentile is considered absolutely forbidden. And the rules that we get in Leviticus at the same time define a certain kind of behavior, which the Jews understood to be their own peculiar form of behavior, defining them and setting them apart from the rest of the world. It's this particular turn, I might tell you, in Judaic history that I do not spiritually identify with. To me, it's a tragic descent from the original peace movement idea. If people ask me today, in what spiritual sense are you a Jew? My answer is something like this: I'm a spiritual Jew in the sense of the great prophet Isaiah, but not in the Second Temple sense of the strict laws of Leviticus, or the strict rules against mixing with the Gentile world and imbibing Gentile culture. No, that's not the kind of Jew that I am. It's the one and not the other. And I see this particular narrowness that Judaism now as a particular, this is the beginning, the first time we actually see Judaism as a particular religion with its own particular cultic practices, the practices that mark it off from the rest of the world. There are always 3 categories of those practices, by the way, which animate discussion in the Christian Bible. They appear prominently. The 3 are circumcision, the kosher laws, and finally, what's number 3? Circumcision, kosher laws, and Sabbath. I always have those in mind as the 3 outstanding things which Jews used to self-define a difference from people, but thus a movement that seemed to depend upon the idea of going viral out of itself, expanding out of itself. Yes, you start by instituting it in one society, but it must catch on, and therefore outreach must be of the essence. Engaging in dialogue with the nations, the others, must be part and parcel of the process. Learning from them as they learn from us must be part and parcel of the process. A certain kind of Jew living then would not have identified with what was going on in the narrowness of the Second Temple that I've been speaking about. And there always have been Jews who haven't. So this takes me to a stage 4 in which I think you get a very, very helpful or useful reaction back in the right direction, in the direction of prophetic universalism, the thing we started with. I think you get that in some of the books of the Hebrew Bible. It must be said that they are a kind of undercurrent. The main thing that emerges, the headlines that seem to emerge about what Judaism is, have to do with the Second Temple. But there's always a stratum of Jewish society which sees itself as inherently universalist, outreaching, intermingling. In these times, Persian times, and then later in Greek times, these are Jews who would go out and study the great thinkers in those other traditions. They weren't just Jews, in other words. They were cosmopolitan people. There is always a core of Judaism which keeps alive this prophetic idea, which is internationalist, which is cosmopolitan. You can see it in the book of Jonah. You can see it in the book of Ruth. You can see it in 2nd Isaiah, especially chapters 40 to 55. Also, the 3rd Isaiah, 56 to 66, are important late documents which keep alive this other Judaism. And so does, I think, the Jesus that we can detect beneath the surface of the synoptic Gospels. The first 3 Gospels give us a picture of the life of Jesus, which I would argue is sufficient to show that he, too, belongs to this internationalist revival, if you will, of the Isaian movement. He is an Isaian. He believes in it fully. He believes in it as a project of world transformation. He's a genius. This is the Jesus that I see beneath the surface of the synoptic Gospels. He is a genius in that he has thought through a great many problems and has specific proposals to make as to how we can change the world into a world of peace. For example, I see in him the first clear, self-conscious idea of militant pacifism. This whole business about love your enemy and turn the other cheek, the Sermon on the Mount stuff, study it closely, and what it turns out to be is actual rules, ideas that people who belong to our movement have to bear in mind as they try to bring about a peaceful world. One of them is, how do you respond to people who are nasty to you? Are you nasty back? No. That's the core of the problem. I'm thinking just strategically, the way my mother used to think. This is something I attribute to Jesus, the idea, but I got it initially from my own mother, who always said, when somebody treats you wrong, what do? Kill them with kindness. Don't respond angrily. Actually, respond constructively, thoughtfully. Instead of anger, you can show sadness. Yes, you can be sad. but don't be angry. There are ways of fighting. And that's how my mother saw it. That's how Jesus saw it. I want to say I'm using this adage that my mother had, kill him with kindness, as a way of accessing the meaning of what the Jesus movement was all about. Strategically, I think he had some brilliant ideas. Very concretely, he was also very clearly involved in the tax rebellion movement. Inherently nonviolent, but very aggressive. This man wanted to change the world. He had strategies for doing so. He had strategies for personal transformation in mind. How to change your way of being so that your psyche, your very psyche, is different. You got to do this. You got to be, we call it conversion if you want, but you got to be changed in your very spiritual essence if you're going to be somebody who fights for the world of peace we're talking about. I could go on, but stage 4 is the stage that I think, in a certain sense, you can find in the Jesus movement of the 20s AD, CE. And that would be stage 4 of my development trajectory. Stage 5, however, immediately follows. It's what I call, what has been called, Christianity. You see, I want to distinguish very severely between the Jesus I've been talking about up to now and what becomes of this genius when Christianity is formed upon his death. And it is. I see a degeneration here. And that's the surface of the New Testament, the apparent New Testament, this transformation of a Jewish revolutionary, a brilliant Jewish revolutionary in the Isaian tradition, into one's personal Lord and Savior. Instead of thinking, as he did, that the point is to change the world, he did style himself, think of himself as a leader in this movement, but the leader of a movement to bring about the kingdom of God, as they called it, through actual action in the world, transforming the institutions of the world. And it can be done, they thought. Instead of this project of world transformation, you get now the despair that says that we ourselves can do nothing to change things in this essentially evil world. If salvation is to be possible, it is to be possible because Jesus will pluck us out of this reality and bring us into a supernatural world of salvation. And Christianity, you do get an idea of supernatural salvation, not world transformation. That's the natural world that Jesus was talking about, that we've been talking about ever since the beginning of our discussion today. But this 5th stage, which I think deserves extensive study, and I'm only being so brief about it right now because I want to rush through to stage 6, but this stage of degeneration called Christianity is this stage 5, emblematic of it. It's the stage in which I want to save Jesus from the Christians. He's been kidnapped, I want to say, by the Christians, and we must free him. We Isaians, we primordial Jews, must save him from the Christians. That's one emblematic way I have of putting it. Finally, in an outline of a whole study project, in other words, each of these stages is things that bear a whole lot of talk, thinking, digesting, revision of thought. But let me just get to the final stage that I have in my outline, which is stage 6, which is getting back to things. That means in our time, stage 6 is us. The peace movement now. The revival of that peace movement now. The making of connections back to it, understanding and learning as much as we can from it as a tradition, perhaps taking courage from the fact that we do represent, if we get involved in it, the actual inner essence of Judaism and Christianity, using that perhaps as a way of drawing people in. I want to draw people in. I want these things to be infectious. And one of the ways you can draw them in is by showing them, is by me trying to argue with my Jewish friends and show them that this is the inner essence of Judaism, not the kosher laws. No, I'm not saying you can't keep the kosher laws, but a Jew like me says, that's okay, that's a cultural preference. But it's not mandatory, it's not the essence of the thing. That's the distinction. Not to say that you can't do it, not to say that you can't find it meaningful. On Friday night, light your candles. They are meaningful to you. God bless, do it. But don't view these things, these particular cultural items, as being of the essence. Now, the essence is to change the world in the way that we've been talking about. So stage 6 would be the attempt on our part to appropriate all the resources that we have in our time to talk about this, to bring it about. It's what I'm trying to do here. The work that I'm doing here in making a video like this, and in talking about all these earlier stages, it belongs to stage 6. Stage 6 is a stage at which I want to say, may I invite you to join me? Should we have Zoom seminars? What should we do to start talking about these things? Above all, to start talking about the prophetic no-brainer, that the world of peace is something we should demand, and it can be done because it must be done. Or must be done because it can be done. And the must is twofold. You can't avoid it as a command, and it's inevitable. As a result, you got to start believing in these things. I still believe in them. This is it just because my mind is getting addled in old age that I still? No, I always have, and I still do. The older I get, the more of a no-brainer it seems. And the older I get, the more urgent it seems to me to make the point, because I am getting old. I'm not going to be here all that much longer. I want to communicate some of this so that somebody can take the baton from me and continue the race. So there's an outline for you. We'll be talking about each of these various stages. I'll be taking things up. I'll have little videos that I'll make on this or that subject, but I thought it would be useful for today just to give you a sense of the outline of this aspect of the whole project at the roots of Judeo-Christian civilization, as we call it.